Australian friends call a ring-in. I'm a mere scientist, and when Alan asked me to chair this session, I was a bit diffident, but I accepted because, well, for reasons I can mention in a minute. Oh, by the way, Professor Sarah Coakley said to me a moment ago, this Jeeves building, was that somebody who was here before you came? I said, well, actually, they should normally only name buildings after you're dead. For some reason, 10 years ago, they told me they named this building after. By the way, you had your coffee in the old building that I set up this department nearly 50 years ago. Anyway, so, yes, I am still alive. I do apologise. I'd love to have been here the whole time, but my wife had an operation and I felt I should be with her. I didn't get away today to be here for this final session. I'm looking forward to it enormously, partly because for the last 3 decades I've been involved with the Templeton Foundation, setting their policy and vetting their awards. And this being a Templeton funded thing, I particularly wanted to be here to see the tail end of it. I don't know if it's giving away secrets, but for those of you who are interested in Templeton money, a little group of us have just been writing a book which Templeton Press will publish next year, in which we're trying to set out what we think should be the priorities for Templeton funding for the coming years. And I would suggest that if you're looking for funding, it might be a good place to look, because we're setting out some ideas without giving more secrets away. In my chapter, I hold out Sarah Coakley's project as one of the best that they're doing. That's partly because I reviewed it. But do keep that in mind. I'm sorry, David, I'll shut up. But I'm particularly delighted to be here to chair a session with David and Peter van Inwagen. David, I've had the privilege of sitting at his feet when he preaches in the local church here and benefit enormously. But you will know all about his distinction. I'm not going to recite it. I suppose that the award of the Manfred Lautenschlager Award was one of the highlights, but he continues to distinguish himself, and we're looking forward very much to what he's going to say. I'll say a little more about Peter van Inwagen in the next part. We go back some way too. David, over to you, and I'll shut up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful for the invitation. I hope that this paper will show itself to fit, but when Alan asks, it's very hard to say no. I feel like I need to begin with 20 or 30 minutes of prolegomena and definition, but if I do that, I'll never get to the text, so I'm going to jump in. Marie Isaacs has argued that Hebrews replaces the Jewish hope of a restored temple and an earthly inheritance with, quote, the only sacred space worth having, heaven, unquote. Through Jesus' crucifixion, and specifically the corresponding access to God that it acquired, Hebrews reorients the traditional Jewish concept of, quote, sacred territory as located geographically on earth, unquote, by redefining the space as a, quote, beatific state in heaven, unquote. Thus, the author's task is fundamentally hermeneutical. Beginning with his belief that Jesus' death can be understood as a sacrifice that purifies one's interior person, he attempts to show further how the concrete physical locales and external rituals that constituted sacred space in the Mosaic economy on earth serve as metaphors that point to the abstract immaterial realities of being in God's presence. Hebrews, in other words, transforms sacred physical space into a sacred spiritual state. Now, Isaacs is one of many who think Hebrews' language about Jesus entering heaven and ministering there is part of an extended metaphor that depicts the spiritual significance of Jesus' death, in terms of the atoning ministry of the Jewish high priest, particularly with respect to his entry into the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement. In my view, this approach to Hebrews misconstrues the text by mistaking Hebrews' what I will argue analogical reasoning for metaphor. The affirmation and depiction of Jesus' high priestly status and heavenly work in Hebrews, together with the author's conception of multiple heavens that contain a heavenly tabernacle, suggests that the author assumes a cosmology that allows him to draw analogies between the atoning offering of blood in the Holy of Holies on earth and Jesus' atoning offering of himself in the ultimate sacred space, the Holy of Holies in the highest heaven. Given the language of metaphor and analogy that I've just used, some caveats are in order. First, I am not suggesting that Hebrews contains no metaphors. I'm not opposed to metaphors. Hebrews is shot through with metaphors. Indeed, the wilderness metaphor is one of the drivers of the entire homily. The central question I address is how the conception of heaven, implicit in the text, is related to the notions of sacred space and Jesus' high priestly sacrifice as developed by the author. These, I'm arguing, are neither conceived of nor primarily described in terms of metaphor. Second, I am not attempting to engage the larger philosophical debates, around the centrality of metaphor for structuring human language, understanding, and even engagement with reality. The terms metaphor and analogy are, I hope, hopefully tightly enough, I'm sure I'll find out, defined below. They are intended to indicate linguistic tropes that would be recognized within a given linguistic system, not to point to larger categories for conceiving of the very possibility of language and thought. To say that Hebrews' high priestly soteriology and correlated conception of heavenly space are primarily analogical, not primarily metaphorical, is not therefore to make a claim about the nature of theological reasoning in general or the essential structures that underlie language and rationality. So on to what I do mean. Modern interpreters of Hebrews agree that Hebrews' reflection on heaven and Jesus' high priestly work depends upon an appeal to the biblical depictions of the sacred space of the tabernacle and of the high priest's activity in that space on the Day of Atonement. This is a model of some kind. The crucial question is what kind of modeling and corresponding hermeneutic ground the author's project? In her monograph, Metaphor and Religious Language, Janet Martin Soskis carefully distinguishes homeomorphic models from paramorphic ones and examines the ways that these models, especially the latter, relate to metaphors. According to Soskis, to whom I hope I do justice, a homeomorphic model is a model whose subject is also its source. This kind of model represents its subject by imitating its source in a way. A model airplane would be an example of a homeomorphic model. The various elements that constitute the model are so arranged as to be related in a, quote, analogy of structure to the subject that is being modeled. That is, the elements of a homeomorphic model are structured to one degree or another, such that they are located in relation to one another, according to the structural relations among the elements of the source being depicted. Linguistic descriptions of these sorts of models may well apply terms that belong to the associative network of that source. That is, that belong to the set of terms, ideas, and relations that one takes to be fitting or natural for the original object or state of affairs. These linguistic acts are not metaphors. An example, I think, will illustrate the point. If you tell a child to be a good pilot and fly her plane over to the display case and land it there, this language of pilot, fly, and land is not metaphor. This is speaking analogically. One draws upon fitting parallels between aspects of the associative network of a real airplane, the model's subject and source, and the model itself. The use of this language, pilot, fly, and land, with reference to the model, corresponds in a fitting way to the model's source, in some sort of natural or organic way. Central to such use of language is the recognition that, quote, analogical relations all refer to the same thing.
They all have the same res significata, but they refer to it in different ways, unquote. It's from Soskas. Thus, speaking analogically is speaking in a way that, while recognizing differences, also recognizes that the application of certain terms is fitting or appropriate to an object or a state of affairs. Analogy may stretch the meaning of a term by using it in a new way, but that usage does not generate a fundamentally new perspective or picture relative to the subject, since the new application of the term does not invoke what is understood to be a fundamentally different set of associative networks relative to the object or state of affairs being described. Analogy works by noting comparisons that, in a particular linguistic and cultural context, would be understood to identify fitting correspondences between the things that are being compared. A metaphor, by way of contrast, speaks of one thing in terms of another thing, whose associative network is recognized to be fundamentally different. A metaphor, in other words, construes a unified subject matter by way of, quote, a plurality of associative networks, again, Soskas. Speaking in this way necessarily generates a new picture or perspective on the subject matter. To say, for example, that the brain is a computer is to construe the brain in terms otherwise foreign to it, precisely because computer is a term whose associative network is fundamentally unrelated or different from that of a brain. The metaphor makes the relation, and the metaphor may eventually become dead, at which point the language is taken to be fitting or natural. But at its origin, the metaphor is recognizable as a metaphor precisely because of the obvious juxtaposition of different associative networks inherent in the comparison. Soskas argues that this sort of metaphor proposes a paramorphic model for understanding the subject being described. Unlike a homeomorphic model, which could be conceived of as a model of an object or state of affairs, a paramorphic model is a model for an object or a state of affairs. Such models often, therefore, correlate with abstract reflection. Additionally, whereas the subject of a homeomorphic model is the same as its source, that of a paramorphic model necessarily differs from its source, and thereby introduces elements from different associative networks as constitutive of the model itself. Because of these dynamics, the original, quote, theory constitutive metaphor, unquote, that is the central metaphor that proposes a paramorphic model, the brain is a computer, can fruitfully generate additional metaphors by comparing elements of the plurality of associative networks latent within the model. The brain as a computer might suggest things like the brain receives input and processes it. Such a construal can be of immense use for theorizing about objects and states of affairs that are not directly accessible or understood. But how does this relate to Hebrews? Many modern interpreters of Hebrews have, I think, tended to assume, to use Soskas' language, that the depiction found in Hebrews of Jesus serving in a heavenly tabernacle in high priestly terms is part of a theory constitutive metaphor that proposes a paramorphic model for understanding an abstract state of affairs. Namely, the salvation one feels or believes oneself to have as a result of Jesus' crucifixion. The central metaphor, Jesus' death, is the ultimate atoning sacrifice, is understood to propose a model whereby an abstract subject, the salvific benefit one receives as a result of the crucifixion, is construed in terms of an associative network that is fundamentally different from the historical reality of a man being killed by the Romans. The different associative network at the heart of the metaphor is that of Jewish rituals of sacrifice, especially those performed on the Day of Atonement. This model is thought to be especially powerful for the author of Hebrews, precisely because he presses the associative networks it brings together, Jesus' suffering and death on the one hand, and Jewish sacrificial practice and theology on the other, to generate so many other illuminating metaphors. These additional metaphors further contribute to reflection on the abstract existential or spiritual aspects of the historical subject. Thus, when viewed as a sacrifice, Jesus' crucifixion can be construed in terms of the act of blood ablution that affects purification and redemption, like the sprinkling of blood in the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement. Jesus himself can further be construed as the great high priest, whose work is to offer himself to God by dying as that sacrifice. Jesus' death, particularly when understood as the moment of the release of his spirit from his body, at least by many biblical scholars, can further be conceived in terms of his high priestly approach to God. The separation of his spirit from his body and his passing into heaven upon his death can even be construed as the high priest's annual act of passing through the inner veil of the temple and into the Holy of Holies. The author no doubt thinks that from the perspective of the central metaphor, the biblical depiction of the tabernacle offered fertile ground from which many other secondary metaphors could be generated. If the writer's real subject is the death of Jesus is the atoning event, then this sort of metaphorical understanding of Hebrews' theological project is almost certainly correct. The picture shifts dramatically, however, if the author's soteriological center of gravity does not revolve around the supposed crucifixion as ultimate atoning sacrifice metaphor. I've argued elsewhere that Hebrews attempts to correlate the basic proto-creedal narrative of early Christian proclamation. The heavenly Son of God became the incarnate Jesus, suffered, died, rose again, ascended into heaven, has taken his seat at the right hand, and will return to bring salvation to those who wait for him. That's all in Hebrews. With the irreducible process of Jewish blood sacrifice, maybe I should read the first part of that again. Hebrews correlates that early Christian proclamation about the big narrative or story of Jesus with the irreducible process of Jewish sacrifice. This account suggests that the central event that effects atonement cannot be reduced or collapsed into the death of Jesus any more than the atoning effects of Levitical sacrifices can be reduced to the act of slaughtering the victim. Rather, the focal point is, for the author, centered upon the return of the resurrected, and therefore still incarnate, Son back into the heavenly presence of the Father and the angels, just as the focal point of the Day of Atonement sacrifices involves the high priest not killing the animals, but taking their blood into God's presence in the earthly Holy of Holies. Now, a crucial piece of evidence that bolsters this assessment of the author's correlation of this narrative about Jesus with sacrifice concerns the cosmology that underlies his argumentation. If Hebrews imagines reality to consist of the earth and multiple heavens, the highest of which contains a heavenly tabernacle with the Holy of Holies, where God sits enthroned, populated by angelic priests who minister there, and if these heavenly realities legitimate and structure the actual things that go on the earthly cults, then the possibility of an analogical model for understanding Hebrews' application of cultic language to Jesus emerges. Such an understanding of heavenly space would suggest that the author of Hebrews, as is the case with some apocalyptic Jews, understands the relationship between the heavenly and earthly cults more in terms of a homeomorphic model that allowed for numerous analogies to be drawn, not in terms of a paramorphic model that enables metaphorical reflection. So I want to explore that a bit more. In 1978, George McCrae argued for the importance of recognizing two different conceptions of the relationship between heaven and the heavenly temple that's in play in Hebrews. McCrae attends to the important point that the conception of heaven as the temple sanctuary, is different from the conception of a temple complex being located in heaven. The former, he claims, and I think he's right, is associated with Philonic or Platonic cosmologies, at least in Jewish thought, like Philo, and the latter with more apocalyptic cosmologies. But for reasons I discussed below, I don't find his claim that Hebrews somehow is a train wreck of these two different notions compelling. The importance, however, of highlighting the distinction between these two concepts is hard to overstate. More recently, Jonathan Clowans has focused attention on this very distinction. Clowans notes that scholars sometimes conflate the notion of a temple in heaven, upon which the Jerusalem temple is modeled, with that of heaven as a temple, or dare I even say, heaven, the temple as a microcosm. It's such that the temple reflects the forecourt being the earth and the sanctuary itself being heaven. Now, in the Second Temple period and the early Common Era, we can find texts that talk about both of these, but typically, Clowans points out, you find one or the other, not some train wreck of both. Clowans also notes that in cases where the Jerusalem temple is taken to be a microcosm of the entire universe, then the entire universe itself is referred to as God's true temple. The earth is likened to the forecourt of the complex, while heaven is this sanctuary where God is. In the other model, the temple complex on earth is in some way conceived of as a representation of some kind of actual structure in the heavens. In this latter case, the earth is not viewed as the forecourt of a cosmic temple complex, and heaven is not identified with the temple or the inner sanctuary. Rather, just as there is an especially sacred space on earth, which is divided into various spaces and sancta that grow progressively more sacred until one comes to the Holy of Holies, where God's presence dwells on earth most fully, so also in the heavens, there is an especially sacred space divided into various spaces and sancta that grow progressively more holy until one reaches the most holy place where God's presence dwells in the heavens most holy. Unsurprisingly, this latter idea correlates well with the developed understanding of angels as God's heavenly priests, and human priests as their corresponding ministers on earth. There is also here a common conception of the heavenly realm consisting of multiple tiers, or a variety of heavens, plural. One of the key biblical backgrounds or grounds for this conception of reality is the interpretation of God's repeated admonishments to Moses in Exodus 25, 9, and 40, and some other texts, to make the earthly tabernacle in accordance with what he had seen on the mountain. Indeed, how one interprets these passages in Exodus and the revelation given to Moses on the mountain becomes critical precisely at this point. Philo provides a particularly clear example of a Platonic-like interpretation of Exodus 25:9. When speaking of Moses being shown the pattern for the tabernacle on the mountain, Philo says that Moses did not literally see anything, since human eyes cannot perceive the intelligible immaterial forms. The language of seeing is only a symbol, a metaphor, to indicate that his mind or his soul had a clear perception of intelligible realities. Because Moses had this vision of the forms imprinted on his mind, he was able to then build the tabernacle as a microcosm of the universe itself. Philo therefore shows how elements of the earthly tabernacle represent aspects of the cosmos. He emphasizes, for example, that there are so many pillars which represent the sources from which the stuff of the earth was formed and the senses that humans use to interact with the material world. The 4 kinds and colors of material used in the weavings and coverings for the tabernacle represent elements out of which the world was made, so on and so on. Hebrews also appeals to this part of Exodus. The author cites Exodus 25:40 in chapter 8, verse 5, just after saying that Jesus has entered the true tabernacle where God is enthroned in the heavens, 8:1-2. And shortly before, he gives some details of the earthly tabernacle, and then draws comparisons between them and Jesus' ministry, chapter 9 and following. Notably, however, nothing like Philo's cosmological explanations of the construction of and the items in the tabernacle occurs in Hebrews. Rather than show how elements from the outer part of the earthly structure represent, for example, the elements from which the earth was fashioned, Hebrews sets out to demonstrate that just as the earthly tabernacle had certain implements, necessary rituals, and various sancta in which the priests and the high priest perform their ministries, so also must Jesus perform certain rituals in the sancta in heaven, where he engages in his high priestly ministry. In Hebrews 8:4-5, the point is made with some clarity. The author states just before this that Jesus is the great high priest in heaven. In 8:4, he notes that if Jesus were on earth, he would be disqualified by the law itself from serving as even a priest, let alone a high priest. Jesus, he appears to say, cannot minister as one of the regular priests on earth. Given that the author refers in 8:4 to the regular priests who ministered only in the forecourt and the first sanctum, his comment in 8:5a, that those priests serve in a copy and a shadow of the heavenly things, implies that the forecourt and the initial tent correspond in some way to heavenly realities. The forecourt and the initial sanctum, in other words, are not conceived of as representing the lower earthly or material elements of the cosmos, but as copies of things in heaven. The earthly priests are not said to serve in that part of the tabernacle that represents the lower parts, while the high priest alone enters the space that represents realities that cannot be seen, as Philo explicitly speaks. Instead, the author of Hebrews speaks of the whole complex of the tabernacle being related to a structure that Moses saw in the heavenly realm. Philo's view that the earthly complex symbolizes the entire cosmos, which is itself the true temple, differs markedly from the one that the author of Hebrews uses when he looks at the whole structure of the earthly tabernacle as reflecting realities located in heaven and into which Jesus himself has gone. This, I think, is an important contrast. This observation suggests that Hebrews is working with a more straightforward, non-metaphorical interpretation of Exodus 25:40 than the one given by Philo. If the author of Hebrews assumed, as at least it appears some apocalyptic Jews did, that Moses looked into heaven, or even ascended into the heavens, and saw the heavenly structure there, then the language of Exodus 25:40 of the pattern of the realities being shown to Moses is not a metaphor for mental apprehension of immaterial forms, as it is the case for Philo. Moreover, this more literal interpretation of Exodus 25:40 would further imply that the spaces and practices carried out in the earthly tabernacle would be properly organized and composed along the lines described above as an analogy of structure. Rather than conceiving of the totality of the universe itself as the true temple complex, this kind of cosmology would assume that two legitimate temples, as well as two legitimate priesthoods, exist in the universe. One of these, the one in heaven, is the source. The other one, the one on earth, is the homeomorphic model that reflects the heavenly source. As the contrast between Hebrews and Philo implies, Hebrews attests to the tabernacle in heaven concept. Other evidence also points toward this conclusion. I've made various arguments for this in other texts, and I won't repeat these, but I do want to focus on an aspect of language in Hebrews that is a contrast with Philonic language in cosmology, but correlates well with the concept of a tabernacle in heaven. And that's the fact that the author speaks of multiple heavens. In Hebrews 4:14, the writer describes Jesus passing through the heavens. Jesus is said to be higher than the heavens in 7:26. In 8:1, the author claims that Jesus is seated on the throne in the heavens. The sacred heavenly things that, by the way, most of our English translations don't capture this. They render them as singular. The sacred heavenly things that Jesus sacrifices that Jesus' sacrifice purifies are identified in 9:23 as being in the heavens. The congregation of the firstborn, mentioned in 12:23, is enrolled in the heavens. According to 1225, in language evocative of Jewish apocalyptic texts, Jesus is presumably the one who admonishes the readers from the heavens. Were these the only references to heaven in Hebrews, there would likely be less argument over the points that I'm addressing here. The crux interpretum, however, lies in Hebrews 9:24, where the author not only refers to Jesus entering the singular heaven itself, autantan uranon, but also puts this language in apposition to the idea that Jesus entered the heavenly sanctuary. This break from the author's usual pattern is sometimes taken as evidence that he thinks of the cosmos as the true temple complex. The earth is the forecourt and heaven is coextensive with the sanctum, as in the Philonic model. Indeed, McCrae, whom I mentioned earlier, cites this verse as evidence that the author thought of heaven as a cosmic sanctuary, just like Philo. But does this singular reference to heaven itself demand a Platonic or Philonic interpretation? Now, I think it's interesting that Hebrews can switch between plural and singular uses of this word. And what's interesting about it is the fact that one commonly finds this switching between a plural and a singular in apocalyptically oriented early Jewish and Christian texts. Thus, Paul, who clearly believes in at least 3 heavens, 2 Corinthians 12:2, often refers to heaven in the singular. Give a list of references. He can even use heaven in the singular and the plural back to back, 2 Corinthians 5:1-2, with apparent reference to the same reality. He seems to do this in 1 Thessalonians as well, although they're separated. This variation between singular and plural form stands in marked contrast to some non-apocalyptic Jewish authors like Philo and Josephus. The latter, they read the same Septuagint text, which translates in plural based on the Hebrew underlying it. They both read a Greek form of the text. But the latter hold the view that the cosmos is God's temple complex, with heaven itself being the cosmic sanctuary. In keeping with that cosmology, I suggest, both of these authors use the singular heaven consistently throughout their writings. This usage agrees with Greek philosophical speculation about the nature of the cosmos, at least some of it at the time, where the singular is by far the norm. Aristotle uses the plural only to make fun of people who would dare think of more than one heaven. And apart from that, it's just missing until we get to Septuagint and then these Jewish apocalyptic texts. After that, things change. Given that Hebrews' use of plural and singular forms of uranos, heaven, fits with the practice of others at the same time period who believed in multiple heavens and often also attest to the idea of a temple in the heavens, the use of the singular in Hebrews 9:24 cannot, I suggest, bear the weight that McCrae tries to place upon it. It's not a train wreck view. More plausible is the interpretation advanced by Artridhofius that heaven itself in 9:24 refers to the highest of the heavens, the place where the heavenly holy of holies of the heavenly tabernacle was thought by some to be located. That Jesus has entered the highest heaven coheres well with the language of Jesus both passing through the heavens, plural, and now being higher than the heavens, Hebrews 7:26, while still also being in the heavens, Hebrews 8:1. Jesus, that is, has not left the heavens, as one might imagine someone in Philo's or Plato's universe having to do, were that person able to be absorbed, of course there would only be one heaven, but to be absorbed into the ultimate realm of the divine that exists outside the cosmos. Instead, Jesus has been invited to ascend to the highest place in the heavens, the place above all the other heavens where the heavenly holy of holies and the heavenly throne of God are located. Now, the preceding points suggest that the author of Hebrews held to a cosmology along the lines attested in at least some Jewish apocalyptic texts. These texts appear to imagine multiple heavens with a tabernacle structure located in the highest one. As his interpretation of Exodus 25:40 suggests, that's in Hebrews 8:5, the heavenly tabernacle served as the source for the earthly structure. These points support the conclusion that the author of Hebrews works with something like what was identified above as a homeomorphic model, when he reflects on the relationship between the earthly and heavenly sacred spaces. In the author's view, the real subject of the earthly sacred space is also its source, the heavenly tabernacle. Thus, the earthly space neither is an exact replica of the heavenly tabernacle, nor does it represent the entirety of the cosmos. Rather, because Moses saw the pattern of the heavenly edifice, he built the earthly one in such a way as to have an analogous structure, even if the earthly structure is only a shadowy sketch. This analogy of structure further implies, however, a fitting set of correspondences, or analogies, between, on the one hand, the earthly tabernacle and the activities that take place within it, and on the other hand, the heavenly tabernacle and the activities that occur, or at least ought to occur, in that space. So Hebrews and Analogies and concluding thoughts. The preceding discussion suggests that the author of Hebrews has a more realist conception of heavenly space than is typically thought by modern interpreters. That's an important qualification. This implies that the cosmology of Hebrews and the correlated conception of the tabernacle in heaven suggests that if it were the case that a human being were to ascend into that heavenly space, then it would further follow that the application of language from the realm of the earthly priestly service to that human figure would not be a matter of metaphorical reflection on some spiritual abstraction. Rather, it would be fitting to appeal to the associative network of the earthly tabernacle as a way to describe an ascent to the uppermost heavenly tabernacle, because that ascending person would be entering the inner sanctum of that heavenly tabernacle, the very source that determines the structure of the earthly model. In other words, one would be speaking by analogy, not metaphor, in the way defined earlier. The author's analogical reasoning is evident when he speaks about Jesus presenting himself to God in the heavenly tabernacle in sacrificial terms. As was noted above, the general trend in the modern period has been to read Hebrews in terms of what I think is fair to say, a paramorphic model, driven by the constitutive metaphor, Jesus' death is the ultimate sacrifice. If instead the author thinks in terms of the ascension and the actual physical appearance of the resurrected Jesus as the great high priest, in the presence of God, in the highest heaven, that is, in the heavenly holy of holies in a heavenly tabernacle, then the author is not here working metaphorically, but analogically. Just as, one, the high priest in the earthly tabernacle brought the blood of the sacrificial victim into the earthly holy of holies and offered it to God once a year. And that was the high point of that sacrificial ritual, not killing the animal, but giving God the blood. And just as, two, it was the power of the life of the victim that is contained, or even is the blood itself, which Leviticus explicitly said is what affects atonement. So also by analogy, one, Jesus, the heavenly high priest, entered the heavenly holy of holies once and offered himself alive to God. And two, it is the power of the life that he has in his resurrection existence, his now indestructible human life, which is correlated with blood, and that has the power to do what the life of no animal ever could, provide ultimate atonement. To apply these terms and categories to the resurrected and ascended Jesus is not, I suggest, a metaphor, because the associative field of Jewish blood sacrifice is fitting for the context of Jesus' high priestly ministry in the heavenly tabernacle, the very source and subject of the earthly life. Thank you.
I have a response from Dr. Kevin Diller.
Well, it's a great honor to be here, to have the opportunity to respond to Dr. Moffitt. And I think there's just one question that if I could put that question to Dr. Moffitt right now would serve to certify his standing as a scholar in his area of specialization. And that is, how do we know that God likes beer?
Because beer is good. And every good and perfect gift comes down.
Thank you. There's another scholar in here as well. Hebrews. All right. No. I'm doing this, that's terrible. Make sure that's on video. My 12-year-old son thought I should sit down at this point, but let me continue. It strikes me that this paper is ideal for this conference, the aims of the Institute to bring more exegetical work into contact with analytic theology and vice versa. So he presents us with something that is really something here for everybody. I really appreciate this paper. There's a number of fruitful ways that one could proceed in response. And what I'm going to attempt to do is just seek a little clarity about the arguments, mention a few problems that I think I see maybe, and then raise some questions about theological implications for this reading. So starting with seeking clarity, let's begin with an attempt to get clear about three things. What is it that he's objecting to in the paper? What is the alternative that he favors? And what is the reasoning that supports the arguments? So beginning with clarity on what he's objecting to. So it seems to me he begins by specifying that he wants to challenge a certain view, and he gives examples of that view. That the view that there's this basic agenda in Hebrews to show that the literal, historical Jewish sacrificial system and holy spaces are to be understood as metaphors for the fundamental spiritual realities of having one's interior person cleansed by being brought into the spiritual presence of God. View that Hebrews transforms sacred space into a sacred spiritual state. And when the metaphor view is taken, then the imagery of Jesus ministering in the holy places in heaven in what Hebrews calls the true temple of the Lord, that the Lord has set up, and that's also taken as metaphor. But when this is taken as metaphor, it is thought of as abstractly symbolic for the spiritual interior impact of the death of Jesus. So it seems that Moffitt's rejecting first that Hebrews, the reading of Hebrews is spiritualizing, making merely subjective Christ's atoning work, and then secondly, rejecting the idea that the death of Christ is the primary focus for understanding of Hebrews. The alternative that he favors is to understand Hebrews as exploring the analogical connections and structural correspondence between, on the one hand, the earthly sacred space and priestly practice, and then on the other hand, the heavenly sacred space and priestly work of Christ. So in his view, this allows us to see more clearly the climax and focus in Hebrews is on Christ entering the heavenly sanctuary to offer himself as a living sacrifice in the presence of God. It seems to me, however, that he's arguing for two separate but related points. As I read it, the main point is to argue that sort of against the reading of the atonement as a spiritualized abstract metaphor, the kind of thing that might be adduced to support a merely subjective theory of the atonement. And this main point has to do with how Hebrews conceives of the nature of that relationship between Levitical sacrifices and Christ's atonement. But the second point has to do with what we take to be this climactic or focal point of atonement in Hebrews. And on this point, he argues that the focus is on this, the incarnate Christ entering the heavenly sacred space rather than Christ's death. Now, it seems I think he's suggesting that these points are connected, but the connections aren't entirely clear to me. So, then on the reasoning for the argument. On his first point, the arguments marshaled in the paper attempt to provide evidence in favor of the view that the author of Hebrews understands there to be this structural correspondence or relationship of analogy between Levitical sacrifices and Christ's atonement. Appealing to Janis Soskis, calling this a homeomorphic rather than a paramorphic model. If I'm understanding him correctly, he sees his arguments for homeomorphic modeling as providing reasons against reading Hebrews as spiritualizing or abstracting and making merely subjective Christ's atoning work. I'll register some concerns about that in a moment. Moving to Moffitt's second point, if we grant that Moffitt is successful, how would a homeomorphic reading support taking a particular view on just what is the focal point of atonement in Hebrews? It's hard to find a decisive statement on this in the paper. He does say that if the death of Christ is the focal point, then a paramorphic reading is almost certainly correct. He does not affirm, as far as I can tell, the converse, that if a paramorphic reading is correct, then one must take Christ's death as the central metaphor. But does he affirm the inverse, that a paramorphic reading, if it's incorrect, then the focal point of atonement in Hebrews could not be the death of Christ? It seems that he strongly suggests that a homeomorphic reading will lead to his preferred understanding of the focal point of Christ's atonement in Hebrews. However, I think to find his sort of very compelling arguments for his understanding of the focal point of the atonement in Hebrews, one must consult his very substantial and trenchant work outside of this paper. All right, some potential problems. I hope, hopefully what I just did there brings further clarity to his paper or occasions further clarifications from Moffitt. So now just a few words I have for the arguments in the paper. I worry about drawing a hard line between metaphor and analogy. Some of this, I'll admit, is personal. I had a bad experience on a playground with a metaphor. It has to do with the way these distinctions can seem to slip through my fingers, partially because I need metaphors and analogies to understand metaphors and analogies, and this creates this kind of recursive wah feeling in my brain. And so it's difficult to find a clear definition. So I'm not sure that the way that Moffitt limits the term metaphor will work, nor does it seem to fit with the way, at least that I read Janet Saskis and work she's doing on metaphor. Leaving that aside, the homeomorphic, paramorphic distinction, that does seem to me to be understandable and useful, but it comes from the philosophy of science, thinking about how our scientific models for phenomena are thought to relate to the realities that they model. But as Saskis notes, most of those models are paramorphic. So the problem I come to in the present application is simply that I'm not sure that the author of Hebrews is presenting Christ's atonement primarily to provide a model for explaining the Jewish rituals, or vice versa, that the author is recalling the Jewish rituals to provide a model for explaining Christ's atonement. I do think we find an appeal to, and this may be all that he really needs, an appeal to a structural correspondence that provides mutual illumination between the two. Hebrews attempts to help us understand both Christ's atoning work in the light of the Jewish sacrificial practice and Jewish sacrificial practice in light of Christ's atoning work. The author of Hebrews refers to these earthly things being a copy and a shadow of the true heavenly forms, but that doesn't mean that the analogical reasoning that is at work here is itself analogous to a relationship between an airplane and a scale replica. So I don't think we're being given a diagram or a flow chart. Those would be homeomorphic forms. Perhaps the analogic reasoning being employed here is within a paramorphic model, or a partially paramorphic model. Perhaps this is more what we find in Hebrews. Maybe it's more like Bohr's atom than a model airplane. Bohr's model would be a paramorphic model with strong analogies and structural correspondences. Well, I don't know if my reasons to think this is very strong, but some that come off the top of my head after thinking about it a lot include that, one, there are ways in Hebrews in which Christ's atonement breaks from the Jewish sacrificial model. The disanalogies there can be as illuminating as the analogies. And there are passages where, like Hebrews 9:9, where the symbolism is explicitly commented on, and it seems not to be homeomorphic. The first section of the tabernacle is said to be symbolic for the present age. But we might call my main concern an epistemological concern having to do with the gift of revelation and our own limited capacities. The author of Hebrews is trying to get realities that are truly beyond us, that are beyond the grasp of our cosmologies. At some point, the structural correspondences are not as transparent, material, and literal. Now, perhaps this is recognized in a paper where Moffitt suggests that while the author of Hebrews is not employing mere metaphor, still at some points the language is not literal. So we're not meant to think of, to quote, literally of Jesus manipulating his blood in heaven. Now this is potentially confusing to me. The argument seems to say that the author conceives of literally multiple heavens and literally sacred spaces in heaven where God is literally more fully present, which Jesus literally, physically, incarnately entered, but then did not literally manipulate his blood. Okay, well, those problems are probably not so bad. I predict there are good answers to them that lie mostly in my own misunderstanding. Let me conclude with questions for sort of theological implications. I think there are many here that could be fruitfully and illuminatingly pursued. And I'm just going to gesture at two. The first one is on cosmology. I sent my notes to David yesterday, and we were talking about this a little bit, and he said, I was surprised you didn't say anything about cosmology, so I thought, oh, I better. All right, the late 80s metal band Warrant, prior to planting his trilogy, said, heaven isn't too far away, closer to it every day. If Moffitt is right, the author of Hebrews thinks there's a literal physical heavens with literal sacred spaces and a physical tabernacle. And Jesus is the first human to have entered it, and it's just up there. Should we entertain this as a serious possibility, or what should we make of this in our theologizing? Not so much, I think, the idea that heaven is a source in the upper atmosphere of planet Earth. I don't think that I'll see Jesus at 35,000 feet on the flight back to Chicago. In the first place, it's very cold up there. And the expression is not when heaven freezes over. But should we imagine that there is now a physical heaven in perhaps a separate created material space realm? And this is, in fact, where the incarnate Christ now is. And one advantage of the view is it gives an answer to the question, where does the incarnate Christ now exist? The second question is on the atonement. The concluding sentence of the paper says, quote, in this way, the author correlates the larger early Christian story of Jesus with the biblical pattern of sacrifice and shows, by analogy, how Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension into God's presence in the heavenly holy of holies effect ultimate atonement. Emphasis mine. I take affecting ultimate atonement to refer to our being brought into full, reconciled, intimate communion with God, our being transformed so that we can be taken in to fully participate in the triune fellowship. Does the author of Hebrews show, by analogy, how this happens? Or would it be better to say something like explains, by analogy, that? How that is achieved through the whole incarnate ministry in life, death, resurrection, suffering, obedience, ascension, return, how that affects ultimate atonement. It's been very difficult for Bible-reading theologians to agree upon that. It seems that Moffitt wants to steer us away from employing Hebrews in the service of a merely subjective view of the atonement. But what view of the atonement does this reading of Hebrews suggest? I'll condense this just by reference to a distinction that Ellen Schnapp gave us yesterday. She distinguishes between views of the atonement according to where they locate the primary barrier of the atonement. Is that barrier something that must be addressed in alienated and fallen creatures? Or is that barrier something that must be addressed or assuaged or placated or satisfied in God? If the ultimate focus of the atonement is Jesus presenting himself as a living sacrifice in the highest heaven where God is most fully present, does this suggest that the primary barrier to our reconciliation is something that has to be effected or satisfied in God? I would suggest that even if we accept all the insights that Moffitt brings us, or Moffitt's Hebrews brings us, it does not mean that we must take an atonement removes a barrier in God view. But to flesh that out more, we would have to look more deeply at our participation in the two-way ministry of the vicarious humanity of the incarnate Christ in his high priestly role. Let me express my profound gratitude to Dr. Moffitt, to the Templeton Foundation, to the Logos Institute, St. Andrews. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kevin. I mean, it's just so much there, and 8 or 9 or 10 different questions. I can't possibly respond to all of them, but it might be helpful to respond briefly, I hope, to a couple. As far as this question of does Jesus manipulate blood in heaven, it's really curious because you're there with Origen, of all people, who asked the question in his homilies on Leviticus. This is a paraphrase. Could it be that because he still has his wounds, when he approached the heavenly altar, he shook out his blood on the altar? Origen reflects on this. And then he said, well, his mind boggles, as I think all of us do. But, I don't have an answer for that because Hebrews doesn't explicitly give me anything to work with on that as near as I can see. But I'm not sure I would necessarily want to rule it out completely, any more than Origen, of all people, seem not to be willing to rule it out completely. Be that as it may, this bigger set of issues maybe around why, how the particularity of the Jewish ritual is connected to what's going on with the description of Jesus. And perhaps the language I used was not careful enough, but let me at least try to get analytic on this crowd. What do we mean when we talk about sacrifice? This is one of the primary questions. And this is one of those points where I would suggest that biblical studies has something to say to the larger theological reflection on something that we call the atonement. By the way, I may have mistaken here and there, but in my publishing, I do not speak of the atonement, because I take the atonement to already be a systematic, synthetic category. I have no problem with that at all. But when I'm talking about Hebrews, I'm not talking about the atonement. I'm talking about what I think Hebrews is doing to make sense of some way in which Jesus does something which brings God and humanity back together. And I presume that there are a number of problems, maybe along the lines of Irenaeus, that have to be solved by Jesus to bring about the atonement. So by limiting to this, if we come back to this question, what we mean by sacrifice, it seems to me that in the modern world, we think of sacrifice as killing someone. And that's what sacrifice is. That is not a biblical account of sacrifice, full stop. If you take your lamb and on the farm and you kill it and then you eat it, nobody in a Second Temple Jewish context is going to think, oh, something has happened that takes care of my sin and purifies my body. Why? Well, first of all, it's done in the wrong place. You're not at the temple. Now let's go to the temple. If you take your lamb to the temple, and by the way, at least according to Leviticus, it is the offerer who typically does the act of slaughtering. That is not a priestly prerogative. The offerer does the slaughter and then walks away and says, oh, well, now something has happened for my sin. No, if you just kill an animal, there is no sacrifice. Sacrifice is a process. It is a set of ritual events that happen. These are hierarchically structured, and within certain sacrifices, multiple events are necessary, but no one of those events by itself is sufficient to bring the result that the biblical text talks about of purification and forgiveness, otherwise known, I would say, as sacrificial atonement. In order to get that ultimate result, the very thing that the process aims toward, you have to continue the process. And the point where Leviticus most commonly, I'm happy to be corrected here by Hebrew Bible scholars, but seems to most commonly link the achievement of the effect that the whole process aims toward is when priests are doing things at altars. By the way,
how many of us, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but how many of us know that not a single animal is killed on any Jewish altar? 0. Altars are not places of slaughter. Now, does that matter for us? Like this for me is the question. So when we talk about analogy and metaphor, what I'm suggesting is the link up between the way that Hebrews is conceptualizing of Jesus doing something which brings sacrificial atonement, specifically in terms of the Day of Atonement, is the link up between Jesus' death, which I would say was sacrificial, without being the sum total of the sacrifice, participates in a larger narrative. And it's a narrative of Jesus being raised from the dead, and then, like the high priest on the Day of Atonement, going into that holy space and presenting the material of the sacrifice before God. Because however that might work, for me, you asked the question, the gift of revelation. I just think the gift of revelation is precisely the point. Do we just take Leviticus and throw it in the bin? Or does the gift of revelation in Leviticus actually inform how we think about Jesus? And just as a historical point, I cannot make sense of an early Christianity, which has its preformed Christology, and then goes back and uses that as a critical tool to slice up Leviticus. To me, it makes much more sense to imagine that people are thinking, probably on the basis of more than just Jesus' death, also on the confession that he ascended into heaven, and then starting to reason backwards, as it were, and to say, wow, that looks like sacrifice.
Well, I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions before Peter comes. Yes.
That was fascinating. I'd like to pick up on actually one of Kevin's responses, but maybe ask about Christ's perpetual incarnation, to something that I noticed a while ago. I don't think anyone actually denies it, but I don't think anyone has really believed it in 300 years. We tend to think of Obi-Wan's disappearing into the blue mist or something. So can you say more about the doctrine of Christ's perpetual incarnation and how that, obviously that is an advantage of this view that maybe is otherwise kind of a stretch for many of us.
In biblical studies, lots of people deny this, especially when they read Hebrews. In fact, Hebrews is taken by some to be an example of first-century existentialism. And that is, by and large, the target that I'm shooting at within my own guild, so to speak. It seems to me that a bodily resurrection implies that the incarnation doesn't end when Jesus dies on the cross. And a bodily ascension implies that the incarnation continues, as you said, perpetually. I think Hebrews actually, while Hebrews doesn't come right out and say Jesus rose from the dead, there are arguments to be made, which I personally think are compelling. That's why I wrote a book on it, which suggests that when you put that piece in, what scholars of Hebrews have typically found in the modern period very difficult to do, and that is to hold together what we know to be the center of atonement, the cross, and all the language that Hebrews gives us about Jesus making his offering in heaven, suddenly falls into line along this narrative way. And I think that requires a perpetual incarnation. I'm not quite sure if that answers the question, because I don't know that I'm equipped to talk about the doctrine of it, but I think Hebrews is the sort of grist that did precisely fuel the development of this kind of thinking in later, more dogmatic, early Christian reflection.
I want to take a quick show of hands about how many of you would be happy if we went on 10 minutes after 1 o'clock, because I want to give Peter sufficient time for summing up. How many of you? Good, okay.
My hand is down.
So I was really grateful for the paper. I really enjoyed your comments. And I thought what you were going to think of as an illiterate, untutored question, but it has to do precisely with sacrifice. So your sacrifice for sins and so on. But as you know, I'm sure much better than I do, the other idea of Christ as sacrifice is that he's the Passover sacrifice. Do you take the Passover sacrifice to be a sacrifice for sin, or how do you, on your way of thinking about these images and analogies and so on, how do you bring these two together into one focus?
It's a fantastic question. I mean, it would take far too long to really answer it in a way that I would be happy with answering it. Sorry, I hope everybody can hear me. Quick answer from a certain kind of historical approach where we look at sacrifice. Passover is not a clear sacrifice. There's a point at which Passover becomes normalized, as it were. 2 Chronicles 11:35, 12? All right, somewhere around there. Speaks about Passover being brought into the temple practice. Now, at the point that Passover enters into temple practice, my guess is that something begins to change in terms of its conception. It may have happened earlier, but here's the point. In the Pentateuch, at least, I think I'm right in saying, Passover is not a sacrifice. Now, there is a problem with the terminology. And we interestingly find some rabbis questioning this problem. Because Passover is actually called forgive my pronunciation, tzavah? Okay, all right. Passover is called a sacrifice, the Pesach Tzavah. And in Sifrei Deuteronomy 1-9, thereabouts, it's not like I know that text backwards and forwards, I just happen to have thought a lot about this passage in it. You find some rabbis arguing, why do we call the Pesach, the Passover, a tzavah? Now see, that's really interesting, because they see right away, Passover is not really a sacrifice. But what I find even more interesting is what they do to answer their question. They say, well, it's because you do something with the blood. So it's precisely not the fact that you're killing the Passover, well, not alone anyway. It's the fact that the point of analogy that they find is the fact that something happens with the blood. And based on that, at least in Sifrei, they say, okay, so Passover is a tzavah. Now what does that tell us about at least that Jewish conception of sacrifice? It tells us that as much, if not more, focuses on what you do with the blood rather than on what happens prior to that. No, but to come back to Hebrews with this. I actually think Passover plays a significant role in Hebrews. And it's precisely at the point of Jesus' death, which redeems God's people from their slavery in Hebrews chapter 2. But see, that is not functioning the same way as Levitical sacrifice functions in the context of the Mosaic covenant. You cannot, to put it differently, Yom Kippur yourself into covenant relationship with God. The Yom Kippur sacrifice works within an already established covenant, and the purpose of Levitical sacrifice in all of its various manifestations is to help maintain the relationship between God and his people. And before you can get that covenant, you have to redeem the people from their slavery. This, by the way, is why I think the fundamental metaphor in Hebrews is wilderness. Because the people have been redeemed from the power that enslaves them, that is the devil, by the death of Jesus. And now they are in the wilderness while their high priest is ongoing perpetually in his incarnation, making the maintenance sacrificial offering that maintains that relationship.
We could clearly go on for ages with these questions. I think I'm going to have to ask you to address them to David over lunch or something, but let us thank him very much.